Good evening, and thank you for attending SLA Europe's latest virtual event. And thank you very much to Cornelia Andersson from Refinitiv for speaking to us and our members. We will have the ability to ask questions on the GoToWebinar platform, which you can find in your control panel. We will also launch a poll. We're interested in your views on some research trends which we've laid out in the poll, which will launch shortly. I think we're good to go.
Okay, excellent. Thank you, Simon. So hi everyone, and it's a pleasure to be here. So I'm very pleased to be here today to be talking to you about innovation and trends in terms of research and how we manage data and insights strategically. So big thank you to Simon and the SLA, and also to the ENIX team for inviting me and organizing this event. So look, what we're going to do is we're gonna do a poll very soon, where I'm keen to get some of your thoughts, very high level, on some research trends. I'm going to talk to you about the high level, and then we'll dig into what some of the higher level trends really mean for what we see in terms of research processes and changes and challenges. So let me start by introducing myself. Right. So firstly, in terms of introduction, so my name is Cornelia Andersson, and I head up the investment banking business at Refinitiv today. Now, that is a relatively recent role for me. I've been in the role about a year and a half. Before that, I spent many years running research and information teams. So I spent over 12 years with Blackstone, where I was the global head of research and market data. I worked with offshore teams, nearshore teams, onshore teams, embedded researchers, outsourced researchers, and so on. I would say most variants of research and BIS teams out there. For those of you who know SILIP, I'm a SILIP charter holder, and I've also completed the FIA certification. So I do really think of myself as an information professional at heart, even though I do many different roles throughout my professional life. So about a year and a half ago, I made the move from Blackstone to Refinitiv, and not just because Refinitiv was a Blackstone portfolio company at the time, but because I saw a real opportunity to contribute to the industry and to make a change. You know, I'm sure we can agree that there's one thing interacting with service providers and providing feedback, and it's a completely different thing putting your money where your mouth is and trying to do something about that. So yeah, I've been with Refinitiv for just over a year now, and what I'm going to talk to you today about is based on both my professional and personal experience. So I'm not going to cover much detail at all about what Refinitiv does or what our current products and solutions are about. This is definitely not a sales pitch. What you will get, though, is plenty of market feedback. One of the privileges of working somewhere like Refinitiv is that I spend a lot of time talking to industry players. So, ranging from large bulk markets investment banks to private equity firms to mid-size and regional boutiques, and also government institutions, corporates, and really information professionals and consumers across the board. And through those conversations, I get a very good line of sight of the challenges around managing data and insights and research. So let's get stuck into it. And Simon, let's kick us off with a poll, please. Right, so this is a temperature check. Now, out of the options listed on the screen there, which do you think will have the biggest impact on research functions going forward? So let's say in the next 1 to 2 years. Okay, I can see the votes ticking in here. We're at about 90% voted now. And there is a clear winner here. Perfect. All right, excellent. So thank you everyone for that. We're going to come back to the results in a little bit. I'm going to put those answers into context in terms of what we'll be covering. But I'm very keen to get your input now before we go through the rest of the talking points here. All right, so I'm going to start with the big picture, and I'm very much a big picture person. I think it's very important to understand the context that we're operating in. So let's just have a quick look at fundamentals of information. So you probably all heard the phrase that data is the new oil, or perhaps the new gold even. And you know, it might sound like fake news, but it is in fact entirely correct. And in recent years, we've seen more profit in data than in oil. So the world that we live in has changed. Data is produced at an ever increasing rate, and something like 90% of the world's data was created in the last 2 years. It's really an astounding statistic, and the reality is today that data is a raw material for the modern economy. So what this means is that for most firms, particularly in finance, is that data has to be an integral part of your growth strategy. And that data and the means of extracting information and insights based on that data is really important to achieving the firm's growth strategy. And this has several implications, right? So it impacts your vendor selection, it impacts your technology and operational roadmap, and it certainly impacts your budget, because research resources, whether they are pure data plays or something else, are typically quite expensive, right? And often purchasing decisions around information and data are reactive rather than strategic. Market data is often relegated to other functions and is often seen as somewhat of an unwanted expense. And that's not an ideal situation. So what we're really starting to see change in the industry is a situation where we see the leaders taking a very different approach and investing time into the selection process and tying the selection process of research vendors to the firm's strategic targets and focus areas. So I'll talk a little bit more in a minute about what some of the specific changes and specific criteria that we see out there are. Good. So as a quick aside to illustrate my point around the value of information here, let's also take a look at what the market thinks. And how information and data providers are being valued versus other industries. So you might have heard some analysts say that financial data providers are now more valuable than the financial firms themselves. So I think you can certainly poke holes in that statement, but there's something to it, right? So for example, 2 of the largest M&A deals in the past year are information and data related, which really illustrates an investor appetite to pay for perceived future growth. And a quick look at valuations also tell us that information and data firms are highly valued, often higher than other sectors. So with this background and the fact that data and therefore also the workflows around data and extracting insights and information from all of those sources has changed, is much more valuable today, that has a big impact on challenges that we see across the board. So now looking at the financial industries in general. So I'm going to base a lot of what you hear today around financial service firms, but this certainly also applies to corporates and definitely to the big technology firms as well. So there's a number of challenges that firms are facing today. I'm going to call out some of the key themes here in terms of what are defining industry dynamics. So regulations, obviously the gift that keep on giving. The key thing here is not necessarily regulation, but certainly a factor around reporting and processes, which is ESG and sustainable investing. This is something that's gone from being a pretty niche content set to something that is now mainstream and is on everybody's agenda.
Oh, Cornelia, sorry to
Yes.
pipe up. I know from speaking to some members, there's a lot of interest in ESG and particularly around how reporting standards are going to evolve. I don't know if you have any thoughts on that, but I thought I'd jump in and ask.
Yeah, no, absolutely. It's a good question. And what we see here is I think it's only a matter of time before there's more extensive regulation around reporting standards. There are a couple of initiatives underway already. So there's something within the EU, for example, that will look to standardize ESG reporting across the board. We see most development in this space really more on the asset management side of things rather than the sell side. And I think that's for natural reasons. But what is happening very quickly now is that there is demand both from investors and from clients around understanding ESG factors. And I think it's also become accepted that having a strong ESG profile and high ESG scores is likely to create higher returns, right? It's a better run company, it's less risk. There's a whole other host of factors that play into that. And by now, there's also plenty of evidence to support that viewpoint. So I think we're going to see standardization. It's not there yet, right? And there's only a number of different methodologies and approaches to scoring and data collection. So I think standardization is coming, and I think it's only a matter of time before we see regulation as well. And what's going to be interesting is seeing how this expands from primarily public equities into other types of assets as well.
Thanks very much.
Yeah, sure. No, it's a huge topic, right? And it's definitely something that we're spending a lot of time on as well.
The best answer I've heard so far on it, so thank you.
Okay, good. Yeah, no, we're even doing things like developing models for, very typical things such as discounted cash flow models that take into account ESG factors and things like, includes carbon emissions into the cost of capital and so on. So really trying to incorporate this into the core workflows of some of our clients. Another couple of key things that are really important here is that the way that a lot of our clients are working is starting to change, and there's definitely a rise of data. This is something that our clients voice to us consistently, right? So the boundaries between technology and finance are starting to blur, and the same with the boundaries between data and information. Financial institutions are really starting to approach their work in a different way, where data and programming skills are becoming much more important. So big data analytics and the need for tools to interrogate and digest really masses of data to come up with new conclusions and idea generation and business development and so on is becoming much more important. So things like looking for ideas in unusual places is on the rise across banking, private equity, asset management, and so on. And what this means is that there's also a new focus on tools to do this, right? So we sometimes talk about digitization and workflow tools. And if you look at a lot of financial services firms, there's plenty of workflows that are very manual and that are really ripe for modernization. So there is something of a generational shift that's at play here, which is somewhat driven by the influx of newer analysts coming into organizations with a completely different skill set and also a completely different mentality, not keen on sitting in the office until 2 a.m. doing a very manual workflow task. So there's an expectation now that there should be technology and tools that can save time or at least semi-automate a lot of those traditional manual workflows. And then, of course, there's huge pressure on efficiency, right? And this is across the board. I'm sure you're all feeling it very keenly in your teams, but the challenges around resourcing and procurement and really maximizing value from existing resources are there. So once again, the tools become an important part of that. And of course, total cost of ownership, whether we're talking about human resources or whether we're talking about information, data, and research resources, there is a lot of pressure there to make sure that there's a good amount of value and also demonstrating the return on investment for those sources. Let's take a quick look at the next point that I just want to highlight here, right? So, and this is the impact that the pandemic crisis has had. I am going to say that we've seen technology advancement in the last 9 to 12 months akin to what we would have seen in 5 years. There's been an enormous shift if we look across the board in terms of how financial institutions are now interacting with workflow tools, with things like Office 365, with collaboration tools, virtual data rooms, and so on. And I don't think that should be underestimated, right? Because it means that for everyone on this call, you need to have a strategy that really fits into that. And it needs to be very, very technology smart. It needs to be something that is going to set you apart. So what we're starting to see as well is that access to technology and data is becoming a competitive differentiator. So the companies that are able to access information quickly and efficiently, to interact, to collaborate, and to execute in this virtual environment, they're the ones that are coming out on top. Good. And this leads me on to the next point here, which is the fact that workflows are changing. And this is accelerated by the pandemic crisis, without a doubt. But what we're really seeing is, you know, when I'm talking about working in a different way and being more efficient and using technology and so on, what we're really looking at is a couple of key areas. And, you know, I hear a lot of talk about all of these from our clients. I think it's a little bit less clear on how well some of these are being executed at the moment. I think there's definitely intent there, but there's also a learning curve, and not all organizations are really ready for this type of digitalization yet. But look, the key things are automating workflows, right? So really talking about things like pitch book creation, we're talking about things like building comp tables, things like moving logos around on a page. I mean, I'm sure you've all done comp tables that have logos instead of company names, and then somebody moves the chart around and you have to manually resize and move all the logos around. This is something that actually takes time for highly qualified junior analysts and associates, and there's no need to do that manually these days. So those are some of the workflows that are looking to be automated. Other things such as company profile creations, newsletters, and so on. Data integration, so you know, feeding data through workflow tools, whatever they are, is becoming really important as well. So there's an expectation that you should have tools available that interact with your different data sets. Analysts who code. Now, this is one of the areas where there's probably the most talk and the least action so far. So I'd say that every big bank has some kind of program for analysts or bankers who code. There's data academies, there's upskilling programs, everyone's talking about Python. We're yet to see some really material lucrative examples of this being put into play. I think it's one of these things that it's absolutely coming, it's changing, but the question is, will we see this type of work specialized and really ring-fenced to data science teams, or is this something that is actually going to change day-to-day workflows for investment professionals across the board? I think the jury's still out on that one. Predictive analytics. So this is really the holy grail of research work, right? It's identifying insights that tell you something meaningful about future business decisions. So that is something that is highly interesting to a lot of clients. It's difficult to do, but using some of these data tools and applying big data analytics and modeling and so on, we're absolutely moving towards predictive analytics, whether it is on risk scoring or ESG or valuations or perhaps a significant business development. The next point here, I'm going to call out because most organizations are investing significantly into CRM systems, and it's typically Salesforce, right? And what usually happens is the organization spent an inordinate amount of time and money on the foundational stages of cleaning up data, rolling out the system, but then what happens is you get to a stage where you go, oh, okay, but now what? So there's a need to feed in, so to integrate third-party data, whether it's from Refinitiv or another provider. It could be things like news stories or financial information or significant developments. But then the next level after that is that you start looking for some kind of insights, right? So you then get to the stage where you want to augment your CRM system with something that's AI-based or will suggest actionable insights, so, such as, you know, this client just issued a new bond, but their capital ratio isn't where it should be, so you should give them a call, that kind of thing. So what these changes in workflow mean for research firms are a couple of different things. So there's an impact. If we look at all these big picture changes, right, and then we look at how does this impact research functions. So there's two separate areas here, really. There's how those research functions operate, and then it is what is it that they actually do. So if we talk first about how the research functions operate, right? So there's some challenges here that are common across all functions. So pressure on doing more with less. That is absolutely something that's going to continue to exist, and it can, it can always be a little bit of a sort of a struggle to justify your existence when you tend to be a cost center rather than a revenue generator. But that is a real challenge that a lot of functions have to deal with today. And what that means is that once again, the need for efficiency and for having the right tools in place becomes much more important. Outsourcing, this continues to be a factor, and it's a trend that's definitely not going to go away. Demonstrating value add and return on investment. Now, this one is really key, and it's difficult to do. It is a challenge to measure and to KPI these types of functions, without a doubt. But it needs to be done, and the challenge really is not necessarily tracking volumes and productivity, but it's tracking the value add and how can you demonstrate that to the budget owners and decision makers within the organization. And then lastly, the focus on more efficient working and knowledge sharing and management tools, right? So once again, this comes back to having efficient tools and processes in place and really being able to leverage the work that is done across the organization to increase the value and the visibility. Of course, while still staying within guidelines of compliance and copyright and so on and so forth, but that becomes a very key a key focus area. So now let's dig into a little bit more then what's the impact for what research functions do. And this is, this is a section where I'm really drawing on conversations I've had over the last few months with many of our clients that run BIS and research functions, as well also as with stakeholders such as CEOs and CAOs and various heads of the business lines as well. So there's a couple
sorry to jump in, Cornelia. I have a question I know that members will be interested in. There's a lot of talk around automation and analytics and tools like Python. And I think it's transforming the work of all professions, not just the information profession. But what do you think this, you may well be going on to this, but I'd be interested in what you think this means for skill sets and what members should be thinking about as we move into this year.
Yeah, so it's a very good question, and I'm in two minds about this. So I think for survival, it's important to have at least a basic knowledge of what we're talking about, right? So, understanding the basics of Python and what you could potentially do, I think is key. Whether it's actually going to have that much of an impact in reality or not, I'm not sure of. So, when we talk to clients, and particularly to some of the large banks, it's a big theme, right? There's a lot of talk about it. There's a lot of interest in things like bankers who code initiatives. But I've not yet seen many examples at all of how this has been implemented successfully in practice. So I think there's a possibility that we'll end up with a basically expanded data science team. So there'll be some analysts or some resources that are very, very skilled in this, and they will do things like build models, they will do idea generation in a quantitative base. But I think we still need the more qualitative resources and skills as well. So I think it's a moving target. I would absolutely suggest that anyone who's an information professional gets smart on Python. Doesn't necessarily mean that you need to become a coder or a programmer. But the other thing that's worth pointing out here is that most of, not most, but some some information providers, Refinitiv is one of these, actually offer tools that help with this today, right? So I know I promised you there wasn't going to be sales pitch, but I'm going to use this as an example. So Refinitiv desktop solutions, they come with something called Codebook, which is basically an automated tool to build Python API calls. So you don't actually need to know Python code because the tool will build the API call for you. But there's a different way of interacting with data that's in a more sort of non-coder friendly format. So, and those types of solutions, I imagine, will become more widespread, even if they're not today, but they probably will become more widespread. So therefore, having at least a basic understanding of Python, I think, is going to be really important.
Excellent, thank you. So understanding the art of the possible, and that will help the information professionals understand how to use these kind of newer low-code type platforms that are coming through that make use of these things.
Yes, exactly. And think back to the comment I made right at the start of this, right, which is around the volume of data available in the world. That is increasing more than exponentially. So at some point, the only way to interact sensibly with data is going to be through these type of big data tools. So I think they will be very much the tools of the future. I don't think they will replace other types of skill sets, but I think they become much more important. And you know, if you're in a leadership position in information services, then you should be able to talk to it and at least have a view on the topic. Good. All right. So look, so let me talk through just a couple of these points here, and then I want to take a look at the poll results because I think they're really interesting. So I guess data science, I think we covered in big data. This is the thing to be aware of here, right, is whether this creates a conflict with more traditional research functions. In many organizations, data science exists as a completely separate team with a very different skill set and a very different focus. But the boundaries are starting to blur. And I think at some point you have to agree almost what territory belongs where and how you're going to cooperate together. So yeah, the automation, I think we've covered, and that is really around using technology to work smarter, right? It's not necessarily about replacing headcount or anything like that. It's just acknowledging that technology has moved on and there are tools out there that can do this work for you today. Now, the other focus here, and this is an interesting one, is a shift towards more in-depth research. So almost eliminating the lower value add tasks here. And there's a number of examples out there today of organizations that are moving towards enterprise deals when it comes to information sources, right? So they are taking information sources out of the BIS functions or the research functions and putting them on the desktops of most of their professionals. And that is, you know, people have different views around whether that is an effective way to use resources across the firm or not, but it is a factor, right? And what that means is that if everyone's expected to do their low-level research work themselves, the remaining researchers really need to specialize, you know, so they need to go in depth, they need to go really to the subject matter expertise level. And we see the most successful examples of research functions that we see, I would say, are the ones that are embedded in different sectors and different teams, and really are the experts there. Right, so Simon, can we share the results of the poll on the screen? Good, so look, I think this is really interesting, right? So it's really clear that big data analytics and alternative data is a really hot topic here. The challenge there, of course, is for traditional research teams to not be eclipsed by the data science team. So look, data science teams are, firstly, they're really expensive, right? So there will be arguments within certain organizations that you can't just justify having two separate functions. But the other part is that it's a very, very different way of working. So being close to your big data analytics team is really critical. And what I would say, and I have quite a lot of experience of this from my time at Blackstone, where we set up a big data analytics team, and the firm actually really struggled with how to make sense of that in a productive way initially. It was a fruitful and positive working relationship where the research team could provide input to the big data analytics team in terms of how we look at the world, how we look at output, how we look at the data sets themselves. They go into the analysis as well. And I think that grounding is really important to the success there. And then the other themes here, so researchers who code does only 7% of the vote, so that's quite interesting. I actually think they're somewhat related to big data analytics and alternative data. So we'll see. I think it'd be really interesting to repeat this poll in a year's time and see if the results vary. Okay, good. Simon, any reflections from you on the results there?
No, I think it's very interesting. I think it certainly reflects what we're seeing in job specs and conversations we have with clients, and I would mirror what you've said. You know, it's not that suddenly there are hundreds of researchers doing coding, but an appreciation of what is possible with things like Python, with all the other new tools that are coming in, whether it be Microsoft Power BI or Quid or any of these other research tools that teams are bringing in. It's just understanding what is possible, and quite often it is about going and working with an external or internal team that are more sort of technically focused, but it does reflect that, and I think it would be really interesting to run this again in a year's time. And we might hold you to that.
Yeah, I'll be happy to.
Excellent.
Right. So one of the options there is primary research, right? And I am a believer in primary research, and I think there will always be a strong appetite for that, certainly from the buy side, right? So if you're an asset owner, your need for in-depth research is going to be greater than if you're on the sell side, for example. But I think that will change, and the primary research has obviously been quite challenged this year with the lockdowns across the world and our ability to travel and do interviews in person and do site inspections and so on. So I think we'll probably see a lot of change in the primary research sector as well. Okay, good. So I know we're probably a little bit short on time, so I'm just going to wrap this up with a couple of observations around vendor strategy. And let's see, so there's two parts to this really. One is what we see in terms of trends for vendor management. And then the second part is really what are some of those new selection criteria that are being applied across the board. Look, so when it comes to vendor management trends, there's a real focus here on consolidating portfolios and moving away from having a large number of smaller vendors on short-term contracts. I think most firms are recognizing that it's a time-consuming way of running a portfolio of information sources, and it's also relatively expensive to do it that way. Although there are some cost benefits and playing off different vendors against each other, time of renewal, and so on, it's not strategically a long-term strategy that pays fruit. So we're absolutely seeing a shift away from quick wins, a focus on strategic partnerships, so really aligning vendors with the firm's overall strategy and selecting partners that are going to be there for the longer term. So at Refinitiv, we've seen a dramatic increase in requirements for long-term agreements, looking at 5 to 7 years, which is a big change. And I think it really reflects the fact that a lot of organizations are now looking for partners rather than vendors. Workflow integration is also a key thing here, right? It's looking at integrating data as well as products, applications within the client's own internal systems. Now, in terms of vendor selection criteria, what becomes very important here is the is the vendor's technology position. So how flexible are they? How can they deliver content? Is it only through a desktop, or can they also give you a feed? Can they, give you various other types of mechanisms? And of course, the challenge there is doing that in a cost-effective way, right? And not charging a huge additional increase for a feed. What also becomes very important is the vision and the roadmap, because when we're looking at long-term strategic partnerships, knowing where your partner is heading, what are their focus areas, what are they investing in, and how do they want to operate, that becomes very important. Innovation as well, what are the new exciting things that your partner is looking at, and of course ESG and sustainable finance. Look, so with that, yeah,
sorry to butt in again. I know from speaking to many of our clients, they're always very interested in a conversation about strategic partnerships, but the touch points they have might not be they might be working with sales, or they might be working with different parts of the organization, and it's sometimes hard to navigate with certain vendors how to get to that point. Do you have any tips for them?
So good question, right? And a lot of vendors are large, complex organizations. Well, I mean, look, if you're looking for a strategic conversation with Refinitiv, then feel free to email me directly. I'd be happy to talk. With other organizations, I would say, just pressure your salesperson for it. They should be able to put you in contact with the business owner. They would all know who the business owner is that could have that conversation.
Thank you.
I mean, look, another thing that's always good to do is to engage with, design partner programs and client engagement initiatives such as client councils and so on. That's always a great way to build a strong relationship with a potential partner as well. With that, I think I'm gonna wrap up, and hopefully that was of some use. And thank you for listening. I'm always very happy to share my perspectives on the industry, and also very happy to hear others.
Sorry, Cornelia, I've got one more question that's come from the audience. Hi, Cornelia. What's your viewpoint on primary research firms' usage by research teams going forward, and possible innovations in that space?
Yeah, so I guess I said, I think primary research is going to continue to be very important. It is, like many industries, it will have been impacted by the pandemic. So, the part of it that's digital will obviously be completely fine, but the part of primary research that's based on things like site visits and in-person interviews and so on, that is going to have to change a little. I think what we will see as well is a drive towards better platforms and consolidation. So if we look at some of these subsectors of the market, if we look at, for example, something like expert networks, that's a very fragmented industry today, but there's a lot of separate providers. And there's an absolute need there for something that provides transparency and consolidates some of these services. So I think we'll see more in terms of that. I think we'll see a drive towards aggregation, I guess you could say, in terms of primary research. And obviously, ENX1 is a good example of a company like that.
Well, thank you very much, Cornelia. That was really fascinating and really useful for our members, so we really appreciate it. Yeah, we'd love to have you back and revisit what this looks like in a year's time, if that's possible at the time.
That sounds great. All right, thank
Maybe
you.
Maybe even in person.
Oh yes, that would be the dream, wouldn't it? Great. All right. So thank you very much, everyone, for your time, and thank you, Simon and the SLA, for having me.
Thank you very much.